Let's take what we learned about proving triangles congruent and let's actually write some proofs. Basically, you have already been doing proofs, you just haven't been writing them down, but you have been thinking through them with the triangles in proving that the triangles are congruent. Now remember, we've got side, side, side. We have side, angle, side. We have HL in case it's side, side, angle, and it's a right triangle. And then we have angle, side, angle, and angle, angle, side. Those were our 5 ways to prove that triangles are congruent. So here are the things that we want to look at when we go through these. This is a checklist. These are not steps. It's not step 1, step 2. When you are proving triangles are congruent, remember that you need 3 pieces, right? You need sides congruent and you need angles congruent. I recommend that you use a highlighter or an expo marker on your computer screen so that you can mark the parts. It just makes it so much easier to keep up with the pieces that you have. Look at the given information, mark everything on the picture, and then look to see if there's anything else. Are there any reflexive sides? Are there any vertical angles? Are there any linear pairs? Anything that help you to fill out the rest of the piece, the rest of the triangles. Then, once you have the 3 pieces, and you need the right 3 pieces so that everything can be in the right order, then you can finish out your proof and prove what you were trying to prove. So let's look at this. So let's always use our givens first. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to mark the triangle. I'm going to mark everything on the triangle and then I'm going to write it all down. Okay, so I know that AB is congruent to BC. That was given. I know that D is the midpoint of AC. Well, if D is the midpoint of AC, then D has cut that segment in half. Remember, cutting a carrot stick gives me carrots. Okay, so I know that AD is congruent to DC. Now, think, these are all things you're about to write. Then I look and I go, okay, is there anything else that I know about this triangle? Well, I know that those are 2 triangles back to back, and anytime I have 2 triangles back to back, they have a side that they share. They share BD. Because of the reflexive property. Well, now I check. Do I have 3 pieces? Yes, side and side and side. That means I can finish out this proof. So the first thing I write is AB is congruent to BC. I know that because it's given. Now, I like to write my statements out and write my givens in separate statements instead of writing them all in one thing to make sure. And I like to go in, I just wrote a pair of sides are congruent. And so since I have a pair of sides congruent there, I'm done with that statement. And so now I'm going to go on to my next piece. Okay, so then the next piece, I've used this given. Now I want to use this one. So the next thing is that D is the midpoint of AC. Remember, if D is the midpoint of AC, again, that was given. You could have written those all in one step, but I like to write them in 2 just to keep it so that I remember the goal is to get sides congruent to sides and angles congruent to angles. So then that results in 2 results in 3. If D is the midpoint of AC, then AD is congruent to DC. And that's because that's what midpoint means, the definition of midpoint. There's another pair of sides, so I'm going to mark that. There's another pair of sides. So then I need one more piece of information. Remember, we marked it already. I know that BD is congruent to BD because of the reflexive property. Remember, it's what you know and why you know it. There's my other side. Now I have 3 sides. So I need to double check side, side. I have side congruent to a side congruent to a side congruent to a side. Then I can say that these triangles are congruent. Triangle ADB is congruent to triangle CDB. And that's because of the side, side, side theorem. So you just prove that those triangles are congruent. So you're going to do that same thing every time. You're going to mark everything that you know in the picture. Now you can do it as you go. You can mark it all at one time. It doesn't matter. I just like to kind of have a direction. So I like to think through it as I go. So let's look at this. IG bisects angle FIH. Now remember, when you bisect an angle, that results in angles. Bisecting an angle gives you angles. When you bisect a sandwich, you get sandwiches. So IG, this angle, this side right here, bisects FIH. So that angle right there, that little piece of pizza, has been cut in half. Okay, so I'm going to use that first. I've used this. I like to use them and then write them. Okay, what that tells me is that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, because that's what the definition of angle bisector is. Okay, so angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Now notice, I have an angle congruent to an angle, so I'm going to put an A there so I know that I have a good piece. So I have angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. So I'm going to mark that, highlight that. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Then I go, okay, well, what else do I know? So I need to go back to my given and see if there's anything else that I can use. Angle F is congruent to angle H. So angle F is congruent to angle H, so I'm going to mark that. Angle F is congruent to angle H. So now I have another angle. So I've got that angle. So that was given. That's why I know that. So I'm all out of givens. So now, and I don't have enough pieces. That's just angle and angle. So now I need to go back to my picture and decide what else I know. Well, I notice instantly that those two triangles are back to back. They share a side. They share IG. So I write that down. IG is congruent to IG. That's the reflexive property. Okay, now that's a side. So now you do have to be careful. You need to look. You can't go by the order that they're written in your proof. You have to go by what it says or what it shows on your picture. And now it just so happens that in this case they match up, but sometimes the order that you find them in is not actually the order that you need to use. So you just want to always double check. So look at your picture. So if you look at your picture, I've got an angle and then I've got an angle with a side touching it. Okay, the side is not touching both of the angles, so it can't be ASA. That means it has to be AAS. Okay, so then I can say that triangle FGI is congruent to triangle HGI, and the order does matter. It was already given to us, so it's okay that those two are congruent because of angle, angle, side. Okay, so let's start. We always start with our givens. JN is congruent to LN. I'm going to go over here and mark that. JN is congruent to LN. And KN is congruent to MN. I know that because it says so. It was given. So KN is congruent to MN. So I look. I'm all out of statements. That gave me a side and a side. So I either need another side or I need an angle. So I look at the picture and I see, okay, what else do I know? Oh, well, I know that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Why can I say that? Because angle 1 and angle 2 are vertical angles, and vertical angles are always congruent. Vertical angles are congruent. So now I have a side, and I have an angle, and I have a side. I need to mark my little A. I got a little A there, an angle. So I look and I see, okay, so I got to make sure, is my angle in between? Well, if I nail down that angle, it's going to nail down those two sides. So the angle is between the two sides. So now I can say that triangle JKN is congruent to triangle LMN because of side, angle, side. It's that simple. Now, in this case, you could have written your two givens, this statement and this statement. You could have written it as two individual statements, but it was easy enough to write as one, so that's why I did it that way. All right, so let's look at what we've got. AC is congruent to EC. I'm going to write that down first. AC is congruent to EC. That was given. So I'm going to mark that. AC is congruent to EC. It was already marked in the picture for me. Okay, then that's a side. So I know that I have a side congruent to a side. So then I look at the next thing. I'm going to go ahead and write it. I could write it in this same statement if I wanted to. So I'll go ahead and write it. AB is perpendicular to BD, and ED is perpendicular to BD. Now, that was given, so that was all in one statement. So now I'll go to statement 2. Okay, now what does perpendicular mean? As soon as you see that perpendicular, remember that perpendicular means lines that intersect at right angles. So go over and draw those. So it says AB is perpendicular to BD and ED is perpendicular to BD. Okay, so then what I know, always, these always go together. If you ever write something's perpendicular, the next thing that you need to say is that angle B and angle D are right angles, always. Angle B and angle D are right angles, okay? And that's because that's the definition of perpendicular lines. Now, I don't know where I need to go from there, so I'm going to step back from that for just a second, and I'll come back to that. There are certain things that you can do in a certain order, and from here it doesn't matter. As long as I've said they're right angles, there are certain steps that I can take next, but I'm not for sure where I need to go. Here's what I'm asking. Do I need it to go to HL, or is it going to become a side angle side and the right angles don't matter? Do I need the angles to be congruent, or do I need the triangles to be right triangles? Those are the two things that I have to decide, but I don't know that. Now, I can write them both. It's okay to have too much information. You have to have enough information. So I'm going to step back from that for just a second. I'll come back to it. So I'm going to highlight it so I remember to come back to it. So the next thing I look at is, I've dealt with that for a second. AC is the bisector of BD. AC is a bisector of BD. Notice I have a segment bisecting a segment. Okay, that's given. So I have a segment bisecting a segment. So AC right here is bisecting BD. So that means that BC is congruent to CD. So BC is congruent to CD. Okay, and that's because that's the definition of segment bisector. When you bisect a segment, you get segments back. All right, so now here's what I've got. If you look at your sides, look at what you've got. Well, let me see. So I've got a side congruent to a side, and so I've got my sides. Now I got to decide about what to do with my angles. So I have a side congruent to a side and another side congruent to a side. Now the only angle that I have is that 90-degree angle. I don't know any other angles. There's no other piece of information that I have. But what I notice is that side angle. So I can say that angle B is congruent to angle D, but it doesn't do me any good because I can't use side angle side, and I can't use side angle. But what I need to happen is then I need to use HL, but I can't use HL unless it has a hypotenuse, and it doesn't have a hypotenuse unless it's a right triangle. But it's a right triangle if it has a right angle, which I said it did right here in step 2. So I'm going to come down here into step 5 and say that triangle ABC and triangle EDC are right triangles. You have to say that before you can use HL, and that's the definition of right triangle. Now, that step right there could have gone anywhere after step 2. It could have been step 3 or step 4, and I could have included that D is congruent to B. I could have said that also. It just, I wouldn't have used it, so it's an extra step. But it's not wrong to have it. It's just not necessary. So now I know that they're right triangles. Now that they're right triangles, I know that this is a hypotenuse and this is a leg. Can't say that until it's a right triangle. So now, because I have that, I don't need another angle. I have that right angle. I can say that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle EDC because of HL. You cannot use HL unless you have to have these two together. You cannot use HL unless you've said it's a right triangle. And then you have to say that there's right angles. So those things all have to go together to use HL. Okay, and then this last one. WX is congruent to, we've got this, WX is congruent to YZ. So let's go ahead and write that down. WX is congruent to YZ, and that's given. And while I'm here, I've got my congruent sides. So while I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and write this down. WU is parallel to YV, and XU is parallel to ZV. Now, the reason that you're always given parallel lines is because you're going to need angles. So I've got ZV is parallel to XU. There's my transversal. So I'm going to look at these separately. So this is what I know because of the yellow. So if I look at that, I see that angle Z is congruent to angle X. And I can call that angle X. This is the only thing there. Angle Z is congruent to angle X. I can also say, since I know it's going to be for the same reason, I'll go ahead and use this same line to kind of take up less space. VY is parallel to UW. Okay, so that's this, or I had the statements backwards. So this one should be green. I'm sorry. That one should be green, and this one should be yellow. I did them backwards. So now I have the green lines. VY is parallel to UY. Well, that means with this same transversal, now if I use the transversal this way, it tells me that I have this angle is congruent to this angle. So that would be the angle at Y is congruent to the angle at W. Now, why do I know that? I knew the lines were parallel first, so I have to say that first. If lines are parallel, then, and I look, what kind of angles are those? Those are corresponding angles. Then corresponding angles are congruent. So now I look what I've got. I've got a side and I've got two angles. So I need to ask myself, is it angle, angle, side, or is it angle, side, angle, or do I need to go get more information? So I'm going to go back and look at the order that I have everything in. I have angle Z matches angle X. I have ZY matches XW, and I have angle Y matches angle W. Well, if you notice, again, nail down those two angles, lock those boards down, and it's going to lock that ZY in between them. And so now I can say that triangle WXU is congruent to triangle YZV because of angle, side, angle. The order that you have your things in matters, so you need to be sure that you mark them, that you pay attention, and just start marking your shapes. It's very important that you mark your shapes. It's very difficult to do this if you don't, because it's going to be hard for you to keep up with everything. Now, you'll have the benefit of following the logic and just picking out the reasons, but it's good to understand where the logic comes from and why we're thinking the way that we're thinking, so that you